understating of mine. I haven't said much, except thank you for being here and welcome. Professor Thapar, of course, does not need an introduction. Neither does Mrs. Kaur, except that the only thing I would like to add about Mrs. Kaur here is that she is a member of our advisory board on the History for Peace project. This talk is a part of that project, and I won't say anything about it because then I won't stop. That's why we've put these little leaflets. Please visit our website, sign up and become members, because we are hoping to make this a very active community of history educators and people interested in improving the state of history education in our country. And with that, thank you.
Now it looks as if I'm flying a plane. Teacher Ray.
Professor Thapar, I feel honored to be in conversation with you, and I would like to ask you now, first I must make it clear that I would like to speak from the perspective of a school teacher. Teachers teaching history in school. So now you've always said that history is about just understanding the past, and that there is no such thing as objective history. Everyone has biases. The important thing is to understand your biases. Would you be able to tell us something about your own?
Yes, thank you for bringing up this question, because what I said needs a little correcting. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, as I was saying a little earlier. As I was saying a little earlier, we are all used to addressing an audience of university students, and we assume that we don't have to bother too much with how we're putting across history, because the students will follow. But I do realize that teaching students in a school is a totally different story, and a very important story, because it's the first step. If one is going to do something about explaining what history is about, or how history should be taught, how history should be researched, one begins at school level. And so those of you who are teaching in schools are absolutely crucial to the whole understanding of history and how it's to be taught. So thank you very much for coming here. On this question of why do we research history, I have always underlined the fact that the purpose of historical writing and research is to understand the past. I say this because there was a time, maybe 70, 80 years ago, when historians claimed that they were really finding out the truth about the past. Now there's a world of difference between the truth and an understanding of something. Can we ever find out the truth about the past? This is a very, very difficult question, because ideally what it means is that...
Sorry.
Okay. I hope this is better. Ideally what it means is that you go to the past. You go into the past. Now we all know we can't do that. The past, unfortunately, happens and disappears because the present takes over. So you cannot enter the past, you cannot demonstrate the past. Therefore, what do? You can't say we're going to tell you the truth about the past, because we don't know what the truth about the past is. So the best that we can do is to say we will try and help understand what happened in the past. And this understanding then comes from a certain process that we refer to as the historical method, which I'll talk about a little later. So let me emphasize that what we are trying to do is to understand the past. We're not making any great claims about the truth. It's only understanding. And in a sense, that is what brings us a little closer to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is science and the scientific method. Where the whole discussion is, when I talk about the historical method, where the discussion is about the kind of evidence you use, the reliability of the evidence you use, how you juxtapose it, the questions that you ask of your evidence, and the logic and rationality with which you reconstruct your answers to those questions. Alright, so that's one thing, that we are concerned with understanding the past. We're not concerned with the truth of the past. Now, what do we mean by understanding? We want to know how society functioned in the past. So we have a little indication of this. It used to be, the indication was originally based on texts. What do the ancient texts tell us? Alright, so we went through many generations of saying, this is what's said in the Vedas, this is what's said in the Purans, this is what is said in this literature and that literature and so on. We picked out bits of information from the texts. Now, this is a somewhat faulty method, as we discovered. Historians are not what one would call birds eating food. They go to the food and they peck and they pull out what they think is relevant to their understanding of a particular subject. Historians have to see their question in a wider context. What do I mean by a wider context? When you pick up a text, the first question you ask is, who wrote it? Alright, let's say, what is the text from ancient India that you're familiar with? Anybody? The Kautilya Arthashastra? You all know that? Alright. Now, we all in our early works have quoted the Kautilya Arthashastra and said, oh, it says this, therefore in the Mauryan period this happened, and in the Gupta period it changed to that, and so on. None of us at that stage did what we are doing now, which is to say, who is Kautilya? Which caste did he belong to? Which social group did he belong to? What was his intellectual background? Very, very crucial for any author, ancient or modern. It's the first question you ask. What is the intellectual background from which someone is writing? Alright, so then you have to do a study of the author and put the author into context. Very difficult to do with the Arthashastra because it was supposedly written at the beginning of the Mauryan period, during the reign of Chandragupta Maurya, because Kautilya was supposed to be his chief minister. He may have been, I don't know, there's no firm, absolute evidence about that, but it's generally believed he was. But the text was continually revised and rewritten up to the 3rd century AD. So it's very difficult to say what is the intellectual background of the author. You have to say, what was the intellectual background of the many authors that revised that text? Now, this raises its own problems. If you're saying that this text was written over a period of whatever it was, 700 years, then it doesn't represent one period. And this is where many of us came unstuck when we said that the description in the Arthashastra tells us something about the Mauryan period. Yeah, it does. But then you have to say which parts of the text were written in the Mauryan period. So that takes the discussion a little further into greater detail. Alright, the next question you ask is, what is the text about? This is a text on the political economy of those times. Is it a descriptive text, or is it a normative text? Now, what do I mean by these two terms? A descriptive text is a text where the author says, this is how things are, and describes an actual situation. We don't know if Kautilya was doing that. It's more likely that he was writing what we call a normative text, which is, this is how things should be. In other words, Kautilya was writing what in today's conversation would be called a manifesto. That is, this is how society and politics should function, not exactly how they were. Now, this has become a big debate, not just with the Kautilya Arthashastra, but with another category of texts that we all took as descriptive texts, namely the Dharma Shastras, especially Manu's Dharma Shastra. And the basic question that many of us have to ask and answer is Manu actually describing the society as it existed? In which case, frankly, when one reads the whole text, one says, what a horrid society. Or is it actually trying to project what a society should be like and justifying what he's saying by the arguments that he's putting forward? And that second position makes much greater sense. Manu is writing at a time when, the caste system is being formulated, when it's being questioned by the Buddhists and the Jains and the Ajivikas, when there's a lot of coming and going between Indians, non-Indians, crossing borders, frontiers and so on, all kinds of other kinds of knowledge like mathematics, astronomy, medicine is coming from across the northwestern borders into India and going from India across to the other side. It's what we would call a period of great intellectual ferment. Lovely, very nice period. The kind of period we all long for. That, there should be all this talk going on and all this discussion and all this writing going on. So, now, in a period like that, what is the author of the Manu Dharma Shastra trying to do? He's trying to center society. He's trying to stabilize his vision or their vision, because clearly there were many people who contributed to this text. They're trying to stabilize a certain vision of society. This is very different from saying, because Manu says that a woman is subordinate to her father when she is unmarried and is subordinate to her husband when she's married and is subordinate to her son when she's a widow, that this is how it actually is. And then you say, but there are so many examples of women not conforming to this rule. And so one has got interested in the question of what is the purpose and intention of a text? And this is something which is fairly new in the study of how you use textual sources. And then finally, of course, how do you compare what the text is saying to what other texts may be saying and other sources may be saying? Manu may be saying such and such, Kautilya may be saying such and such. Does this square with perhaps what the Vasishtha Dharma Shastra is saying, or what the inscriptions of kings on administration are saying, and so on? So there's a comparative dimension to how you use the text. And then there is the dimension of other sources. So, as far as my period of history is concerned, the period that I work with, which is the early period, the major other source is archaeology. Now, this is the use of archaeology vis-a-vis literature, texts. This is something that's really come into importance in the last 20, 30 years in a major way. And previous to that, we were all aware of it, but didn't use it in a comparative way. And why is archaeology so important? Going back to my original statement that one of the things about the past is that you can't go into the past. One of the interesting things about archaeology is that you can sort of go into the past. You dig a site and you find out the layout of the site, the habitation, you know what kind of homes they lived in, you know what kind of utensils they used and that kind of thing. And there's a certain kind of, I don't know how to put it, it's almost a kind of thrill that a historian gets. I remember the very first time when I seriously went into an excavation, because I was reading archaeological reports and couldn't make any sense of them because they use all kinds of technical jargon like stratigraphy, typology, ceramic typology, and this, that, and the other. And I was just going around in circles thinking, what do I make of this? And I remember speaking to a senior archaeologist, and I'm talking about the 1960s, and I said, how does one come to terms with this kind of terminology? And he said, there's only one way out. Go and join an excavation. So for 3 seasons, over 3 years, I joined the Archaeological Survey excavation in a site called Kalibangal, which was a Harappan site. And I remember the first season when I arrived there, completely new to this, not understanding this whole business of digging up and how you dig up and so on. And in the morning I got ready and I went to the director of the excavation and said, what shall I do? And there was a little hesitation on their part because everybody else was young technicians, young archaeologists, all male. And this female turns up and says she wants to join the excavation. So what do? So they did what they thought was one way of, in a sense, excluding me and shutting me out. They said, oh, we'll put you in the cemetery area. So I was taken to the cemetery area. There was a grave that was marked out. And they said, you start excavating this grave. And they explained to me how it was to be done. That the first 2-3 inches of soil you use a pickaxe because you're not likely to find anything and you put the earth aside. Then you go down to using what they call an archaeological knife, which is about that big, 6 inches to big, and you quietly and gently scrape surface after surface. And it's only when you come to the skeleton that you have to use a surgical knife, because you have to be very, very careful not to in any way harm the skeleton being extremely delicate. So anyway, I lowered myself into my grave, and there I sat for about a month and a half excavating, and finally got down to the level of the skeleton. And it was both a little eerie, frightening, and very exciting that there was the skeleton of this body that had lived 2500 BC, which is 4,500 years ago. And they were coming all the time, 2 or 3 times in the day. They'd come and say, yes, as you excavate, dig there, you dig there, now you see what you're digging. They were explaining it to me as I was going along quite nicely. By that time, I think they got used to having this strange creature on the camp with them. But I remember my excitement. It was the burial of a woman. She was lying on her side, and clutching in her hand was a little tiny 4-inch bronze mirror. What must have been a mirror, because it was a piece of bronze which, if you polished, it would shine very heavily. And I remember picking this out, putting it on my hand and saying, the last time somebody touched this mirror was 500 years ago. And here I am holding this mirror. And that gives you a tremendous connect. And it's really, in a way, it's a bit sad that archaeology, when you hear archaeologists speak, they very often only talk about stratification and typology and this and that. They don't give you that sense of touching the past, as it were, which I must say I felt very, very strongly at that moment. And I remember another occasion at another excavation where there was a brick, and obviously when they were patting the clay into shape to make the brick, somebody had impressed his hand on the brick. So after it was baked, that the impression of the hand was on the brick. And I was walking past, it was on a wall, and I put my hand on the impression. And that again, you know, it's sort of... So that's the kind of way in which, in a sense, one can get a feeling of the past. It's not completely alien. And I mean, I'm not suggesting that all of you run off and now join excavations and that kind of thing. But do remember that there are ways in which one can get a sense of it. One isn't actually in the past, but one can get a sense of it. And I think that is important for a historian or for, you know, your teaching history. That the children should be made aware of the fact that you cannot literally move into the past, but there are ways in which you can try and get a feeling about the past. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
I wanted to know about your own biases.
My biases, yes, all right. Now, what I meant by that was not, I must clarify this because it's sometimes mistaken for the fact that in our times there was a movement, an intellectual movement that literature people are only too familiar with, called postmodernism. And I see from your smiles that you all know about it. All right. Now, postmodernism took everybody by storm, and a lot of people started following postmodernism. And I was always, as a historian, very worried about the popularity of postmodernism, because from the point of view of the historian, the one thing that disturbed me was not that postmodernism said everybody has biases, because I accepted the fact that everybody has biases, but they said that everybody's reading has equal value. And that is something that, as an old-fashioned positivist, empiricist historian, let me underline that, positive empiricist, I cannot accept that everybody's reading has equal value. Because for me, it's absolutely essential that you recognize the fact that you give priority to certain ways of questioning the evidence. And that is what allows you to say that all the evidence doesn't have equal value. It's like the basic question that is often asked, that you have a description of a particular kind of pot. For example, the Vedic texts talk about a kind of pottery that is called Nila Lohita, the black and red pottery, which is a very special way of making pottery. It's in the fire. You fire it in a particular way, and the pot that comes out is half black and half red. And the archaeologist has pottery, which is called the black and red ware culture, because it's a pottery that has these characteristics. Now, you cannot say that the description of that pottery, if it applies to the black and red ware, we're not sure, is of equivalent value as the actual pot. For me, as a historian, that black and red ware pot has a greater value as evidence and object than the rather vague description in the text, which may or may not apply. I'd like to think that it applies. It's not every pottery that is called Nila Lohita, but nevertheless, there it is. So that's one way in which one has to be careful about bias. The other is that in trying to come to an understanding of the past. What does it mean? What do we mean when we say we're trying to understand the past? What it means is the historian is trying to explain the past. How did something happen? First of all, when did something happen? How did something happen? Why did something happen? The how and the why are absolutely crucial. Now, explanations, therefore, vary. Every historian puts a different weightage on the explanation that he or she gives. And when you're studying history, you have to always keep in mind that the explanation that you're being given comes from a particular historian or a group of historians, the case may be. And the question that you have to always ask as students of history or teachers of history is this weightage legitimate? So that every explanation, mine, yours, theirs, so on, has to answer that question. Is the weightage that we're giving legitimate? And that is what I meant by saying that we have to recognize the bias of every historian. Bias is not always a bad thing. It's sometimes, it's there. People read things and people read them according to their own knowledge, and they read them according to the evidence as they see it and so on. That is where a lot of the personal element comes in. I may see something as a bit of evidence, the other person may not. So you have to convince the other person that that is actually a bit of evidence. And so the question is not so much of, oh, this is bias, let's leave it aside. The question should be, if it is bias, if I think that this explanation is biased, I must investigate that bias and see why it's there.
Thank you. Now comment the fascinating way in which you describe the historian's craft. Would I think indicate that you would make a wonderful detective writer or a thriller?
Oh, absolutely.
I think so.
Absolutely. In fact, my students, when they come up with the first, even to the students, the MA students of JNU, the first semester, the first course that they used to take with me when I was teaching, I would say to them, now this weekend, you pick up an Agatha Christie novel and read it. Particularly something like Death on the Nile, and understand that this is what ancient history is. Now, there's a world of difference between ancient history and modern history on this question. We don't have sufficient evidence. So we take the same texts and they're constantly pulling them apart and saying, can it be seen this way, can it be seen that way? And a time comes when you kind of groan and say, not another book on, for example, the Bhagavad Gita. I think there are about 360 translations and so many studies, and you say, oh my God, again another one. It's the reverse with modern history. They have a plethora of evidence, archival, private papers, the literature of the time, masses of evidence. There the problem is choosing the evidence that you wish to use for your particular argument. So it's a rather different approach that way. But of course, like all good detective stories, once you've started pursuing the evidence, you look for every possible clue that you can get. And that's part of the fun, and it's also part of the boredom. Because if you're looking for every possible clue, you're constantly going through the same text again and again, thinking that somewhere there'll be a verse that will let slip a little bit of information that no one else has noticed, and you notice it. On the other hand, it's tremendously exciting in terms of, if we find this little bit of evidence, how are we going to use it?
But when you say that modern historians can choose their evidence, then you can tend to be silent about certain things.
You can tend to be silent, yes. But that is, of course, where the test lies, that when you publish, your colleagues are just waiting to pounce on you. So when you publish, if you are silent about something, they make it very clear that you've been silent about something.
Now, historians wear labels. You have been called a Marxist historian, Eurocentric, and many other things. An academic terrorist.
An academic terrorist.
I wanted to know the meaning actually of academic terrorist.
Well, you must ask Mr. Murliman or Joshi.
I will. I think to get response to emails, I would like to ask, because I don't know what it means.
Yes, I don't know what he means either, but anyway, we're shooting other people, I suppose, academically.
Oh, academically. No, what I was asking is that can't you write just as a historian, instead of, speaking or writing from a particular perspective or ideology? I'm just a historian, I needn't to be from a particular school of thought.
Well, I am interested that you raise this point because it's something that I've been arguing for a long time, that we don't necessarily have to label any social scientist, leave alone a historian. And in one of my recent books, which is called Talking History, it's a book-length interview with a couple of people, I tried to make this point, that you can be a historian in which you can use the theories of explanation that came up in the 19th century and the early 20th century. You can try them out. And there may even be one theory that you think is the most suitable, and you can use it. But that doesn't mean that you are only that kind of historian. You may be using other theories. It also depends on what is the subject that you're investigating. I mean, if you're investigating, let's say, ecological history, then the modes of production will play a very, very lesser role in that than if you are investigating economic history. So that also makes a difference in the kind of history that you are investigating. I'm, of course, in the very happy position that there is a large body of public opinion that condemns what I write by saying it's all Marxist nonsense. But the Marxists, on the other hand, and certainly the leading Marxist historian, is on record as saying that I cannot under any circumstances be called a Marxist historian. I am a scientific historian, yes, but not a Marxist historian. So I have these two bodies of opinion saying exactly the opposite things about me, and I'm just sitting there saying, well, you guys decide.
But that is indeed a happy position.
Well, that's why I personally don't use a label for myself, but I'm just waiting to, let them decide.
You talk about knowing the historian's background in order to know where all the writings are coming from. Now, you have worked with two historians, A.L. Basham and Dr. Percival Spear. Would you say that they were writing Indian history and their perspective would be different because they're not Indians?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up quite a lot, and in fact was brought up in this Talking History book by one of the people who's out asking the questions. Let me clarify that I didn't know Spear. I mean, I met him a couple of times and that's all. No, he's written a totally separate volume.
Oh, we were
and one of the interesting things about Volume 2, one of the interesting things about Volume 1, which I wrote, and Volume 2 that he wrote, and many people have commented on this, is how totally different the historical approach is. Which was inevitable. I mean, Speer was writing this book at the tail end of his career of a particular kind of historical writing. And I was writing this book right at the beginning of my career when I was thinking very differently. See, so the two...
All right with that? That someone else with...
Well, in the sense that the two volumes were never put together as two volumes of the same thing. I mean, they were always sold as separate volumes. And it was recognized that the two kinds of history were separate, yes. Yeah, that was well known.
Now, when I was preparing for this talk, I borrowed Somnath from Megha, and after reading that, I don't know how people can dare to be history teachers. The reason is that there are so many complexities and nuances I found. For example, we speak very simplistically about Hindus and Muslims. And from your book, I gathered there are so many different expressions. And also, for example, with the temple, you had the Jains, you had the Shaivas, and so many. You can't really simplify these things, whereas in school we learned Ghazni, Mahmud of Ghazni, attacked it, read it 17 times, and the Hindus were traumatized. And you explained that also. So, how do you think that a school teacher would deal with all these complexities?
Well, I think this is partly really a demonstration of what we mean when we say that India has always been a multicultural, plural society. And no one ever defines it. Politician after politician gets up and says, we are a multicultural society, full stop. What is a multicultural society? A multicultural society is precisely this kind of society which has multiple nuances right across the board from this end to that end. And the nuances are juxtaposed. Sometimes the edges overlap, but they're certainly juxtaposed. And they negotiate with each other as to how they are to live and, the boundaries, as it were, if there are boundaries, and if there are no boundaries, if there are no boundaries. In other words, it's a kind of perpetual negotiation of my position and yours in order to ensure that we carry on doing what it is that we want to be doing. Now, I think that this is, it stems, I'm sorry, I'm going to be very long-winded on this, but it stems a bit from our understanding of religion in this country, the history of religion. The history of religion and the invention of the term Hinduism was a 19th century invention. All right. The colonial scholars come along and they find this complete range of religious articulation. They don't know what to do with it. And they have to put it into blocks because that is how they are familiar with the history of religion in Europe, that there were blocks. So they set about taking up all these different strands and molding them into blocks. Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, that kind of thing. All right. The blocks don't work in Indian history because you never had one block facing another. You had multiple occasions when one strand contradicted the other and there was conflict and disharmony between the strands, but it affected just that. And this is one of the interesting things about Indian history, that an event that's taking place, let's say in Gujarat, Somnath, is disturbing Gujarat and is disturbing parts of Rajasthan because who are these new people that come in and start doing all of this? But the Cholas who are ruling at that time and ruling very effectively and are great rulers, empire builders, they've never heard of Mahmud. They have no idea of what's going on in Gujarat. Now this is not because there was an absence of nationalism. Yes, there was an absence of nationalism because nationalism is a modern phenomenon. It didn't exist in those days. But primarily it is the understanding of people didn't see, the Cholas didn't see themselves as we are as a Hindu bloc, and these guys coming in from Afghanistan are all Muslims. Therefore we Hindus are against those Muslims. They saw these people coming in as marauders, attacking temples for wealth and so on. And so, that's a local problem. It's the local people who have to handle that. It doesn't concern us. So this kind of decentralization of religion, as it were, is something which was characteristic of Indian religion right the way through. I mean, from the very beginning you had these little pockets, as it were, of differences, and people not seeing themselves as monolithic religious categories, which is what the 19th century introduced. So I think it's interesting that the term Muslim, for example, doesn't come into the Indian vocabulary till, I think, about the 15th century. They're always referred to as Turushka and Tajik and Yavana, and they're all old terms of people across the border of different cultures. I mean, the Yavanas, for example, go back to the Greeks, the Indo-Greeks, and the Hellenistic Greeks. And the same term is used for the Arabs and the Central Asian Persian Muslims that come in. So it's both a historical continuity, and it is the fact that it's not essentially a religious term that is being used. And this is something that one doesn't realize. And I must say that when I started researching the book on Somnath, and it was completely accidental, one of my colleagues was retiring and she had done some first-rate work on sacred geography. So we decided to have a seminar on sacred geography. And everybody else had their pet temple and their pet mountain and their pet whatever it was. They'd done religious studies and all of this. I was the only one that didn't have this. I'd been doing other things. And I thought very hard, what should I do, what should I do, what should I do? And then I thought, why don't I take up a theme that has been well worked on and see whether attitudes towards that have changed. So that's why I decided to take up Somnath. And when I started researching it, the first lecture I gave on it, I stopped in the 15th century. And then various people said to me, oh, but there's the whole Jain tradition and there's this and that. Everybody had looked at those as independent traditions. I mean, first-rate work has been done on the Jain Merutunga's Prabandha Chintamani, which is a Jain chronicle of the Chalukya kings of Gujarat. First-rate work. But nobody tied it up to the fact that this was the same period at which the Muslim chronicles, the Persian chronicles, were saying that every sultan went to Somnath and converted it into a mosque, attacked it and converted it into a mosque, which is complete baloney because there was only one person right in the 18th century who did that. And when I started looking at these texts, I said, my God, this is another world altogether that is existing. And it's never been looked at by historians. Why was it not looked at? Or in the Sanskrit inscriptions, one very famous inscription, which every economic historian refers to. There's a ship's captain from Persia, Hormuz, who comes to Somnath and wants to build a mosque. There's a terrific trade going on between Somnath and the Persian Gulf. And the Somnath temple gives a donation of part of its estates for the building of the mosque. So much for the Hindu drama. Anyway. And this whole inscription goes into great details of, who are all the people in charge of the city of Somnath, all good, respectable Rajput Hindus, and, how this donation for the mosque was collected and the mosque was then finally built and all the rest of it. The Sanskrit inscriptions are full of descriptions of this kind. So when I started looking at all this material, I said this is another story altogether. So this is what I wrote. And it was very much a case of, small segments, cultural segments, that had been individually investigated. but never brought together. And the bringing together really, in a sense, was what gave one a different insight into the problem.
I found this to be an extremely important book for many, many reasons, especially in view of what is going on today. And I love the title, Many Voices of History. But I think we would all agree that there are very few sane voices these days. Because people are now resorting to mythology, they are distorting history, and they're deleting things which, if I speak as a school teacher, that they shouldn't be taught this and they shouldn't be taught that. And that is something we don't like, because they must know.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you were talking about blocks, and it reminds me of periodization. And earlier it used to be, I think, Hindu, Muslim and British. Am I right?
Yeah, right.
And then I wonder that if it is religion they're talking about, then why isn't it Hindu, Muslim, Christian?
Yeah, well, this is the question that has been asked. That why did Mill make it British? Partly because his argument was that traditionally India has consisted of two nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, which is of course complete nonsense, because a nation is something that comes about at a certain point of history, and it's very much a modern concept. It's a modern situation when people get together and say, we are a nation. And this is something that hadn't happened in India before. But that was part of the reason. He was trying to prove that the history of India is determined by the fact that there were these two nations constantly at war with each other. This is basically a colonial understanding of the past, which the current Hindu right wing has happily taken up and is repeating without publicly acknowledging that it's getting it from colonial sources, which it should be doing. But nevertheless, it's that. So that is part of the reason. Periodization also comes into the Somnath thing. You see, the reason why the Jain and the Sanskrit sources were not consulted after Mahmud's reign, only the Persian chronicles and the Persian sources of the sultans were consulted, was because the Hindu period ended in 1200. And the Muslim period began. And when the Muslim period began, you didn't consult Sanskrit sources, you only consulted Persian sources. So this periodization really had a disastrous effect on history, in the sense that it the cut-off points was totally artificial, because Sanskrit literature and text continue right up till the 17th century, when Braj Bhasha takes over and Tamil takes over and so on, the regional languages take over. But right through that period, as is being shown now, for example, there's a book by a young American historian called Audrey Truschke, who shows how Sanskrit literature was being translated and discussed in the court of Akbar, and it went on in the court of Jahangir, and it went on in the court of Aurangzeb. So one cannot say that Sanskrit literature ends in 1200. But that was the theory in those days. You see, they never consulted anything. And of course, regional languages were considered inferior. I mean, we only look at the literature that comes from the elite groups. The regional languages were all common popular things. We don't pay any attention to that. That's changed. Now everybody's talking about history from below, so the text, the regional languages have become important.
But what do you think of this periodization, ancient, medieval and modern? Because dates have to be shifted all the time.
No, that periodization was based on Hindu, Muslim and British. It was a bunch of nationalist historians who said we can't call it Hindu, Muslim and British because that's not secular. So they changed Hindu into ancient and they changed Muslim into medieval. The dates remain the same. The Hindu period ended in 1200, the Muslim period, the medieval period, as before, the Muslim period went from 1200 to 1750, Battle of Plassey. And that was, we had two reasons when we decided to give up on ancient, medieval and modern. And that was partly that it was not viable to do this. And secondly, that you can't describe 2,000 years of history simply with the label of one religion. It's not representative. So we gave up on those. We gave up on ancient, medieval, and modern.
So what is it now? How is it?
Well, it's ancient or early, up to about the 8th century AD. Then it's early medieval, which is 8th century to about the 14th century. And then you have medieval, and then modern. Now they're talking about early modern, which is late 17th, 18th century. But this is now going into very
complex, because I won't ask you how it's done and so on.
Yeah.
Now, I am very curious about this beef eating business because yes, because I know that in school, even as a student and as a teacher, we knew that people ate beef, and we didn't quite know how and why beef eating was forbidden. And we were told and we taught that it was for economic reasons. But I believe it is far more complex than that. And would you be able to enlighten us, because it's so relevant to our times?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I really haven't investigated beef eating, partly because there are so many people investigating it anyway, so really think it's worth my while to also stick my foot into it. There are two ways of approaching it, and this has been actually done very nicely in a book, again by an American historian called Bruce Lincoln, Priests, Warriors, and something else, cattle keepers. He talks about how the Rigvedic people, the Vedic people generally, were essentially cattle keepers. They were cattle pastoralists. Certainly the Rigvedic people are cattle pastoralists. And it's quite obvious that they were, because the economy is based on cattle, the head of cattle that you get and how you use them and so on. And a lot of the analogies to everyday living are also based on cattle descriptions, cattle labels. Now, if you compare cattle keepers across the world, and Bruce Lincoln does this very nicely in his book, he compares it to the African Nuer tribe. The Nuer, N-U-E-R, were cattle keepers of the Sudan, and were very solidly cattle keepers, like were the Rigvedic people. I mean, the Rigvedic people also did a little agriculture, but their basic economy initially was cattle, and then it went on to include more and more agriculture. If you look at cattle keepers, one of the characteristics, and this is true of many pastoral cultures, is that the animal that they herd is an animal that they don't indiscriminately kill. It's only on special occasions, when something is being celebrated or when a festival is being held or whatever it may be, that the animals are killed. Now, what is interesting about references to beef eating in the Vedic texts is that it's generally associated with you're either honoring a guest or you're making a special gesture where you're killing something which is very, very valuable to you. You're really gifting a very valuable possession to the person to whom you're doing it, or the people to whom you're doing it. So there is that element that in pastoral societies generally, the animals that are kept and that are treasured are usually not the animals that are eaten, but they are eaten on special occasions, and there is no religious ban on their being eaten. So one presumes, the other thing one presumes is that all cattle keepers, animal keepers, what do they do when the animal is died? You know, obviously people will eat the flesh unless it's died of some terrible disease or something, but they would otherwise eat the flesh. And then you have lovely little nuggets here and there. My favorite is the verse in one of the Upanishads, I've forgotten which one it is, I think it's the Chandogya, where it says, when it's talking about rituals to be performed and so on, and it says, if you want a son who will grow up to be very learned and understand philosophy and so on, you must feed your pregnant wife on rice and veal. Now, if your pregnant wives are all going to be fed on rice and veal, and then obviously there's beef being eaten. So, you know, little giveaways like that, which should be collected. I mean, these are not texts where people will stand up and shout and say, beef will not be eaten or beef will be eaten. You have to gather the information from these kinds of little side comments that are made. All right. So there's enough of that to say that. Then there was this famous excavation at Hastinapur, conducted by an archaeologist who has now become very famous because of his insistence that the Aryans are indigenous to India. Mr. Devi Kar, Dr. Devi Kar. Devi Kar conducted this excavation at Hastinapur, and in the report he says very clearly that the area where the kitchen and the cooking, the hearth, is located in a house has a lot of animal bones, including cattle bones, and the cattle bones carry cut marks that knives have been used in cutting those bones. Now, why would you use knives in cutting cattle bones unless you were actually going to use the flesh to eat? This is common sense. And he says that it suggests that possibly beef was eaten at that time. This is Hastinapur, and he's talking about, you know, the Vedic and the Mahabharata period and so on. So, one cannot say that it was never eaten. It was certainly eaten. There are differences as to who is permitted to eat it regularly and who doesn't. And of course we know that from the Gupta period onwards, it was the Dalit communities that lived outside the cities that were expected to collect the cattle carcasses. And when they collected the cattle carcasses, one assumes again that if the cattle had died a natural death, they would help themselves to the meat that the carcass had. It would make perfectly good sense. And so the story continues and people keep it. Now, what is interesting is that, yes, in the sort of what we call the early medieval period, there are references in some inscriptions to you cannot kill a Brahman and you cannot kill a cow. These references do come. But then later references, and the question then is, why at a certain point in history does this become such a strong injunction? One of the reasons could be that we also have at the same time inscriptions in which Brahmins who are given a lot of land grants, because remember it's the Brahmins who are performing rituals for the kings, it's the Brahmins who are legitimizing the kings. If the king wants a genealogy, he goes to a learned Brahmin and says, make me out a genealogy proving I'm connected with the best of the Kshatriyas. And this is done. Now, when they're given a gift in return, it's either land and very often it is cattle. And when you read the numbers, it's always 300 cattle, 400 cattle, goes up and up and up, and there's one inscription, there's even 300,000 cattle. And you wonder, where did all these cattle come from? But anyway, So the gifting of cattle was part of the gifting of land as well. Not as much as the gifting of land, but you do have these references. Now, if you're gifting cattle and if Brahmins are then herding cattle as well, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, there would be a tendency to say that you cannot indiscriminately kill cattle. That the old tradition would come back again, and that would continue right through to the period where Brahmins were receiving cattle as gifts. Now, when does the actual ban on cow slaughter come? That's quite late. That's British period, 19th century. And one suspects that that is probably at the injunction of possibly Brahmins who owned cattle and who said that, this is an animal that is sacred and it shouldn't be killed, and so there is the whole movement of cow protection. So the thing is that one has to look at it historically. You can't just answer the question, did they eat beef, did they not eat beef? It's a question of what was the occasion, how much cattle was there, what role did the cattle play in the economy, and that kind of thing. And indeed, what role the ban on beef eating will play today in the economy. There's an absolutely brilliant article in the Times some time ago by the economist Thapar, who explained in great detail how it was an economic disaster to say that cows should be protected because it was against the farmer. The farmer, when his cow becomes unproductive, has to give it to a slaughterhouse. He cannot maintain an unproductive cow, otherwise he'll end up with a completely lopsided economy in which he's just maintaining unproductive cows. Now, these are all issues which, in today's day and age, we like to think that we are thinking people, we're rational people, we sit and work these questions out and then take decisions. So if that is the case, then there is a lot of thinking, working out to be done before we rush in with our armies of Gaurakshaks to kill Muslims and Dalits simply because they're carrying cows.
So history has become central to politics. I shouldn't say it has become. I think right through the ages, history has been used and exploited and sometimes distorted, to gain power or to establish and brainwash. You have said that there's no such thing as collective memory, and memory is shaped. And when it's shaped, I think that a little bit of brainwashing happens as well, because people are told what to believe. And when this happens, you see that they select certain historical figures, suddenly a statue is put up, and just as Somnath was so important for many, many things, similarly today we have this Ram Mandir controversy. So when all this happens, we are sometimes given a sanitized version of history. If you look at some of the textbooks, I'm not talking about what the CBSE, the National Board textbooks will be like, because I think they have accepted that you were right in saying that beef was eaten, but they said it's not right to teach children this.
That was the original debate in the 1970s, where the book was attacked for saying that beef was eaten. And I responded to the attack and gave them all the references and so on and so forth. And then the reply was, possibly yes, historically it was eaten, but it is morally incorrect to teach our children that it was eaten.
So we don't know what's going to happen in the new textbooks.
We don't know what's going to happen.
Although the portions have been removed. Now I find that your writing, you keep calling the writing dense, or your students say that, when you're writing as a social scientist. But when you write, for example, Somnath, it is so easy to follow, and it's a page turner, it was for me. But there are certain phrases which I didn't understand. One was the philosophy of unconcern. You have mentioned that.
The philosophy of
Unconcern.
What was the context in which I...
Oh dear. You were discussing the politics around the Somnath temple, and we're talking about different people looking at it in different way and selecting
yes,
texts and so on.
that's really a case of some people will do selecting because they have a certain point of view which they want to push. There are others who may not select and may just take what's given to them in a philosophy of unconcern. That means that for decades now we have been treating the Somnath thing as a very simple thing of he came, he destroyed the temple, wiped out everything and created a Hindu trauma. And people sat quietly and went on repeating it. That is a philosophy of unconcern.
And I think students need to understand the historian's craft, the process of writing history, in order to understand it.
But students need to understand the historian's craft, yes. Equally important, more important, students have to be taught to ask the question why, how. Unless they question what is given, they will never understand the historian's craft. The questioning is absolutely fundamental, and I keep repeating this to the point where people groan and say, oh, there she goes again. But, you know, in our system of education, in most places, there are rare exceptions, but in most places they're told, this is what it is, you learn it by heart and you repeat it in the exams. Thus, don't ask questions. And then you have ministers who get up and say, asking questions is completely wrong. The point is, asking questions is fundamental. It's fundamental not only to schooling and education, my God, it's fundamental to life. Whatever you do, unless you pause and say, why am I doing this, or how am I doing this, or what is this all for, you may as well not live.
So I found that interesting about the minister Munshi, was not allowed to reconstruct the temple through the government. I think.
Yeah, but that's a different issue.
No, it is. But at the same time, you see, we are talking about secularism, which has become a very charged word now. But the fact that people have to perceive the central policies as unbiased and not favoring a particular religion. So that particular temple not being done by the government, it was a way of telling people that it is.
That's right. No. I mean, this was a contention between K.M. Munshi and Jawaharlal Nehru. K.M. Munshi, who was interestingly the education minister of all things at that time, who insisted that the temple of Somnath must be rebuilt. And this was not the temple that Mahmud had destroyed. This was the temple that was built by the Chalukyas later on, which, according to the Jain texts, was not destroyed. It declined and degenerated because of the bad policy of the ministers, what he calls the Ku-mantri, the bad ministers. And because the temple was on the shore of the sea, and the sea waves kept hitting it, and it got weathered and it got weakened, and bits of it fell. Now, Munshi said it's got to be rebuilt. The archaeological survey said, no way, this is a protected monument, it has to remain as it is, because it is an example of 13th century Charukya architecture and so on. But Munshi insisted. Then he came to Nehru and said, we want the government to finance the rebuilding of the temple. And Nehru said, no way. He said, we are a secular government, we don't build any religious monuments. You go and set up a private trust, and you do it through a private trust. So that is what Munshi did. And in fact, Nehru had many problems because they asked Rajendra Prasad to come and do the consecration. And Nehru said to Prasad, please don't. You are the president of a country that is a secular democracy. As in that role, in that official role, you should not be going and doing this. But Rajendra Prasad said, no, I will do it, and went and did it. And there were various other ministers who also attended the function and made their, whatever it was, participated. And I think that was one of the reasons why Nehru, in a subsequent letter, wrote to somebody and said, I often think I am the only secular minister in this government. And how right he was.